outbreaks of plague that we know happened in the 8th century, is that writers use the plague, and again, this is a subsection of people, we don't have everyone's thoughts, but writers use the plague as a way to critique the wealthy, right? So that John of Ephesus, for example, he may have said that the poor died first, but his real critique was of the rich. And it was the rich essentially robbing their other rich neighbors to basically clear them out after they had died, is something he spends a lot of time stressing, right? Or clearing out the money changer next door, these types of things. Now, there's obviously biblical things involved here, but the critique, interestingly enough, is against the rich as the discourse, as the language, as the rhetoric, which I think is something interesting and certainly something different, perhaps.
I will add that if we want to look at later pandemics, for example, the third pandemic in India at the turn of the 20th century, there we actually do have very good data, good colonial data, British data that was collected, and we actually have statistics that they put together. And there is a very clear class difference. So if you're at the top class, the British class in India, your chances of dying of plague are 20 times less than the poorest class of local Indians in India. So, and they actually, there's a gradation there. So wealthier non-Indians die much less frequently than poor Indian populations. But that's not, again, that's data that we simply don't have for the earlier pandemics, definitely not for the Justinianic.
Okay, Joe?
So I see another question here from Lena Hamad. Would we have been better off or better prepared in the US with the COVID pandemic if our leaders just acted sooner? Based upon, I guess, responses from previous plagues and empires.
Well, I don't know how political we want to get. I think there's always ways in which different countries react in different ways, and some were certainly more on top of their game, for lack of a better term, than others. And I think, what I've read a lot of the 1918 influenza literature for various reasons. And the issue is a lot of the information, at least during the initial outbreak in last March and April, there were good scientific historic studies of the 1918 influenza pandemic. This is Howard Merkel's study that told us exactly how waves would play out, how to stop them, how to prevent them. And most of that was not implemented or was not done. And this is what I was kind of hinting at the end of the talk, is just because you know what to do doesn't mean that you necessarily will enact it, because political will and political authority, power, all those dynamics are really obviously at the base level of this. So this is kind of what I was hinting at by getting at the point that, just because we know something doesn't mean we act better, is how I would leave it.
Would you like to add to that, Lee?
Okay, we have some questions relating to, for example, by R. Dimitrov, relating to things such as, I'm trying to frame these as a question, they're more like comments. In the Justinianic Plague period, they did not have vaccines. So does this make a difference, I suppose, in relation to mortality, for example? Would you like to respond to that, Merle, Lee?
So yes, obviously we don't have vaccines for the Justinianic Plague. We also don't have vaccines for the third pandemic. So we can really take the third pandemic as a hypothetical comparison. I mean, it's obviously not precise, but I think it does show a few things. One of the things the third pandemic data shows is and I think Merle mentioned this at some point during his parts, is the differential effects of plague in different times and places. So some communities, you take a population, India, 300 million people, divided into different provinces and states and so on. Some of these places suffer greatly during the third pandemic, others barely at all. Why is this difference? We can only hypothesize, but the data does show that some areas do massive damage even without vaccines. And others do not sustain that damage even without vaccines as well. So it's probably a combination of ecological factors, micro, local ecological factors of there being enough species that can serve as hosts and vectors in that particular area, the climate being more or less conducive for plague to survive. There's been a lot of work trying to find what exactly are the factors that influence plague, both social factors and ecologic factors. And as far as I know, there has been no consensus on this matter. So ecologic factors are the easiest to argue for and the easiest, I guess, to rule out. People at this point have argued that plague is more prevalent in climates, warmer climates, drier climates, and wetter climates. So I think it's really idiosyncratic, again, both ecologically, but also socially.
All right.
Okay, Merle, would you like to respond to that, or?
No, I mean, I can just briefly say this is why epidemiology exists, right? You try to put together social, human, environmental, and other factors and throw them all together. The problem when it comes to the plague is we don't have parameters to run those models. So you basically are making up parameters to begin with. And if you're making up parameters, which is to say you're making up how many people, how they're interacting, then you're essentially kind of just almost making the whole thing up. And that's kind of the problem when it comes to a lot of these examples. But I'll leave it at that because I see there are a number of other questions in the queue.
Okay, Professor Brian Averbush asked if he could ask his question.
Hi, yes, thank you for a fascinating talk. So as an Islamic historian, all this is very interesting to me. And if I could work my will, we'd talk about this for 3 hours. But since we've only a few minutes, 2 questions that I'd like to get your perspective on. So in our field, the literature, as I understand it, rarely looks at well, okay, any historians, not going to attribute major change usually to, to one thing and say, okay, monocausal. And in the literature on the Islamic conquests, the plague is usually mentioned, the Justinianic Plague is mentioned as a contributing factor, something that certainly did not help the Romans hold the line, having dealt with this for decades. And Arabia seems to have been, relatively speaking of different impacts in different regions, relatively less affected by this. My question is about the Roman army. So Kyle Hart, and armies like cities, particularly vulnerable to outbreaks of epidemic disease. If there are severe demographic losses, you've got recruitment problems. What I remember from Kyle Harper's book on this is that he, and this is off the top of my head, but I believe he says climate change, the plague, also invasions over time, and political problems. He lists all of these factors, and he shows that the Roman army's ability to field significant forces declined rather dramatically in the, I believe it's the 6th and early 7th centuries. So what I'm interested in is your perspective, so if we're talking about short and midterm impacts, do you see the plague as a significant contributing factor in problems with imperial defense? That's question one. The other thing would be about differing mentalities about the plague in the Islamic sources, but maybe the first question first.
So I guess, do you want to do this, Merle, or? Okay. So I guess one way to think about this is that, to take the graph that I showed, right? So the graph of the decrease of 50%. That's actually from Kyle Harper's book. He argues, again, for a drop of 50% of the population in 542. So that's the most significant drop in the context of the Justinianic Plague. So let's take that as an example. In 541, 542, the 540s more broadly, the empire was engaged in 2 major wars, right? One major war with Persia on its east, and another major war with Italy, trying to reconquer Italy. The empire was able to field armies in both cases, was able to stop the Persians on the east, was able to reconquer Italy. Yes, it took more time than they wanted, but they eventually did it. And in the middle of all this, they were also able to send another expedition, an expeditionary force to conquer parts of Spain. So, I mean, you could argue that the empire can't field enough armies, but it's still expanding. So I guess it's a question of how you want to look at this. But to my mind, at least, the evidence, the political evidence, the military evidence, doesn't seem to show some massive decline of potential manpower. It's not that before. I don't see a clear cut in 541, 542. That's what we would expect to see. Yes, there are problems in the empire, but those problems have started way before the 540s.
So may I follow up with that? Do we have time?
I think we're getting, we've got a second question. So if we could just say, maybe Merle would like to respond to your second question, Brian, because I know there are people in the line.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add to the first part that the Gothic Wars, which is the wars that are happening in Italy at the time, there's no reason to expect plague to have only hit the Romans, right? It would have hit the Gothic troops too. So this is also kind of an issue that no one ever addresses. Everything that happens to the army is only the Roman army, not the Persian army, not the Goths, not the Lombards. It's only the Romans. The second question, to preempt your Islamic question, I want someone, and I've been begging someone for a year now, more than a year, 2 years now, to do the Islamic sources, to go into the Arabic, to go into the Persian, to go into the Armenian. Lee and I have done the Latin, the Greek, and the Syriac, but we stopped at the Arabic. As you probably know, Brian, the problem with the Arabic is a question of none of the sources are actually from the 6th and 7th century. They're all much later, so that creates problems. But I've